Hello and welcome to this seminar. This is a research seminar from the Research Center for Performance Practices. I'm Ben Spatz, and my co-director of the center is here, Emily Worthington, and some other folks from University of Huddersfield, where this is virtually hosted. I will just introduce a little bit about the center, and then I'll introduce the speaker, and we'll get going. So just to say something about the Research Center for Performance Practices, it's a fairly new center. It comes out of the combination of some older, smaller centers established in 2018. And we have essentially a focus on practices research, practice research, performance studies, and some other historical, critical, analytical approaches to performing arts disciplines, especially music, drama, and dance. This spring, we've been relaunching our Lines of Flight research seminar series. It's been a really lovely series, and I think some folks here have been able to attend some of the previous sessions, all very different, all focusing in different ways on practice research. This is the last of our series this spring, so I don't have any invitation for you immediately to say, please come to the next session. The next session will be possibly in the autumn or else in the spring when we organize a new seminar series for the next academic year. But please do look out for that, because we will certainly be organizing another series. I think this series was really successful. I'm really proud of it, and I'm really looking forward to the next series next year. Without further ado, I will take us into today's presentation, which is by Manola-Gayatri Kumarswamy, who is based at University of the Witwatersrand, and I'll tell you a little bit about Manola. I've known Manola for a few years through the Performance as Research Working Group of the International Federation for Theatre Research. And I've been a great admirer of her work in a lot of different ways, and I think a lot of that will be evident today. I'll read you a little bit about her biographical background so you know who you're hearing from. She's an artistic thinker, somatics-informed performance practitioner, poet, and organizational transformation consultant. She received her PhD from Theater and Performance Studies at Jawaharlal, I should have learned how to pronounce that better, Nehru University in New Delhi, and is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Drama for Life and Theater and Performance at Witwatersrand University in South Africa. She is co-convener of the IFTR Performance as Research Working Group, and she's co-editing the Contemporary Theater Review special issue, What's Queer About Queer Performance Now? She also works with personal and systemic transformation with methods from arts practice, dream work, and group work. She co-facilitates trauma therapy workshops through Drama for Life. She's taught in performance, drama, women's studies, literature, and development practice departments in India and in South Africa. And she's currently on site in the Western Cape, following a Mellon grant with Arts Research Africa to explore fluidity and queer decoloniality through writing residencies, ocean encounters, and whale stories. That is really what I hope she's going to tell us more about today. The talk is called Bodies at Sea, Desire and Freedom in Artistic Research. As I understand it, there will be some guest presenters as well, but I will let Manola introduce them, and I'll go quiet now and witness. Thanks so much and welcome.
Thank you, Ben. Can I share screen? Is that?
Yeah, let's see if there's anything I have to do. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, I'm not going to move into the slide mode because then I get really confused about when to change them and send them. So I'm going to keep them with you all getting to have a peek at what the next slide's going to be. There we are. Okay. Before I start, I want to also thank my colleagues and friends, Welma Dibia and Busiswe Malangu, who are with me and will co-hold the Matrixia. Well, I'll do that. And Busisi Way, a poet, performer, and dreamer, who's written the book Surviving Loss, will also, and who's been in co-residency with me, will also be reading some of her work in between. So, Bodies at Sea, Desire and Freedom in Artistic Research. Welcome.
And I the oceans float, till it comes to the biting great ships. I'm saying the ones harm the blue tongue. Watch 'em down, flip side, watch 'em flips. Ain't no prayer rising for this crescent moon. Oh mama, ain't I hearing the oceans below? Oh mama, ain't I the oceans float? Them great reverberation of silence hit deep below my heart, slows down the beat. Oh Lord, isn't this a phantom speed? Oh Lord, but these rhythms acres need. Oh mama, ain't I hearing the oceans below? Oh mama, ain't I the oceans flow? Oh mama, ain't I hearing the oceans below? Oh mama, ain't I the oceans flow? Oh mama, ain't I hearing the oceans below? Oh mama, ain't I the oceans flow?
Okay, so desire, freedom, and at being at sea. The work that I've gone into looks at the ocean as wilderness, both outside, but also looks at the wilderness within the psyche. Two of the sort of key insights that I had over the last year in particular, as we lived through both the lockdown and coming back to South Africa, was that for decoloniality, the question of trauma and loss was quite fundamental to understanding post-colonial subjectivity, and that ecological grief, loss, and trauma cannot be separated from our thinking of the collective self. So this is, so these two sort of fundamental insights really has changed the trajectory of my thinking and my work and practice to reach where I am, really a little bit at sea and by the sea right now, as well as I sort of navigate forward how to think, how to practice, and also simply how to breathe. Some of the ideas that I look at and I play with is to look at desire in personal, subjective ways, but also desire as a principle of eros in the evolutionary drama, and this sort of the multiple cosmologies that we're connected in through it, and how the call for epistemic freedom that Manola-Gayatri, a decolonial scholar and thinker from South Africa, how this question for epistemic freedom relates to the question of both desire and artistic research, as well as our, I think also our search for multiple cosmologies to explain how we want to think about life, our cultures, and our ways forward in terms of how we want to live. I started off, I'll come back to the call that I had to the ocean, which happened in July 2020. But before that, I'd just like to read you something from the Natya Shastra, which tells you how the lover and the heroine must go to meet her lover. While hurrying to the place of the tryst, if the heroine is a courtesan, her body is to be beautifully adorned with various ornaments, and she is to walk slowly in the company of her attendants with a display of passion and joy. In a similar situation, the woman of a noble family is to cover her face with a veil and walk timidly with the limbs contracted, looking back very frequently and fearfully. The situation remaining, if the handmaid is to go to meet her lover, she will walk with uneven steps, with eyes beaming with amorous joy. Her talk shall be distorted and incoherent through intoxication. After going there, if she were to find the lover sleeping, she has to awaken him with the following mode of attention. The noble lady shall awake him through the jewels, making them tinkle, the courtesan through the sweet, cool scents, and the handmaid by fanning him with her clothes. On this occasion, the scolding words of the female companions shall be strong but sweet and conducive to consoling her. When I received my call to the ocean, I didn't go like a courtesan or a woman from the noble family or as a handmaid. I went a little irritably and annoyed, feeling this compulsion and desiring it, but also not wanting to be uprooted from an extremely happy routine that I had in Johannesburg over 8 months. And my first steps when I went to meet the ocean were, well, what have you brought me here for? So that was really where I started. And 7 minutes into staring, there was just, again, quiet and filling and sound and just knowing. And since that first day in December, when I came back for this particular, to keep myself open to this particular encounter with the ocean, it's been something of a journey, and a journey that's taken me both back and forward and inside. And that's partly a little bit of what I'm sharing with you here. I think one of the other ideas that was difficult for me to finally sit with or to think about was the ocean as an anxious space, as a space of anxiety, as a predatory space, to encounter it as a violent space, and to navigate that and think through what that means for us, but also immensely powerful and useful. So the phrase epistemic freedom, as I kind of place it here, comes from the way Manola-Gayatri, who wrote Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Decoloniality, and he speaks about different modes of knowing and knowledge. And it's here that in other work that I also connect that among these other modes of knowledge to free up, what is the possibility of practice, performances, research, or artistic research to allow us into these ways of knowing. I mentioned earlier the next two really important turning points, which was understanding the role that trauma, complex trauma, intergenerational trauma, and the quality and the experience of loss that is so fundamental to when we work in post-colonial spaces, but when we are coming and working through a post-colonial subjectivity, and how do we develop processes and methods to work through this grief and this pain and this desire that also comes through the register of loss. When is a loss a good loss? How does that sit in our bodies and psyches? What happens when something is taken away, leaves, dies, is lost to us? How do we know and feel this loss? How does this loss sit within us, and what do we do with it? Some losses, like the deaths of loved ones or the leaving and separation from parents, siblings, lovers, or friends, are personal and have a shape, memory, stories. There are losses of habitats that we grew up in, a tree we loved, a forest or river or ocean we dreamed of in pristine states. There are losses of political visions. There are the losses we're taught and begin to feel or to project in the absence of what we do not have, like vernacular languages, cultural practices and knowledge systems that were erased or made foreign to us, that we now hear and see in gestures and glimmers, in fringe surviving cultural practices, or which indeed may be thriving within closed subcultures from which we have over generations been distanced. These losses of culture and knowledge in post-colonial contexts have been partially due to colonization, but also due to industrialization, urbanization, and what sometimes appear to be personal and political choices. For Dalit intellectuals and activists like Ramesh Nathan, fighting the continued daily personal and systemic violence of the caste system, some cultural practices should die and be lost to us forever. In psychoanalytical terms, loss may also be understood as a complex projection of lack or imagined insufficiency and absence. In Buddhist terms, we might understand some of the pain of this loss as the inevitable suffering when one is dealing and learning slowly to accept the constancy of change. What I came across when I wrote a poem 2 years ago was this line which looked for the promise of the ocean, and though I hadn't really seen any plants, ocean plants, then the line said, and I swim with ocean plants, their roots afloat like ours. This was the character or the avatar of the journey woman, who here in the Western Cape, where the ocean is also called a kelp forest, really found and discovered a relationship here with kelp, which a lot of post-humanist scholars and thinkers have also done work on. I think about kelping also then as a PAR concept, and practice that emerges as a response and strategy to work through loss, partly as an alternative to contemporary efforts in decoloniality, but also more accurately as a gesture that embodies and realizes some of the hopes of decoloniality, which is to say it is a gesture emerging from the soil of decoloniality, or may be called a post-decolonial gesture. Decoloniality often remains in a dialectical lock with the colonial, and a colonial that is every day robustly reimagined, with a continued projection of who the colonizer is and a constant subjecting of oneself into the subjecthood of the colonized. Many contemporary practitioners and scholars in the Global South, particularly in performance pedagogies and healing, find the polemics that decoloniality has spawned sometimes an unproductive space for the journeys we wish to make. Rage is useful and necessary in many spaces, but without moving into other reimaginings, it sometimes limits the scholarship and practices that are ready and ripe to be moved into. It is not just a question of reimagining what our practice or thinking could be. It is also a desire to follow impulses already present in our work and which breeds us into a magically real episteme of performance, knowing, and deep trans-discursive and transhuman connections that are planted within it. The different experiments of this practice, performance, play, is what I mean as I still work through the idea and work through the metaphor of kelp. Kelp used as a verb, as a thing and practice of doing, as a gerund even, which by doing does, which also by doing becomes itself. Wilderness is also co-considered as site, space, but also the psyche. In particular, I consider oxidation and respiration fundamental interpenetrative or intersubjective gestures of tree, which Annette Allanda has also spoken about and initially brought to our notice at the IFTR working group, within an ecology of other beings and how we might come to understand relationality through this. Psychotherapist Eigen, as early as 1977, formulated an interesting proposal around identity through a phenomenological reflection on breathing. A key point he makes is of the interpenetration of the inner self and the outer world. That process of breathing stays in constant relation with, and of how necessary the containment and expansion is for us to stay alive. He thus speaks of how in breathing, the insides of the body are continuously fed by the outside world, a continuous interpenetration of bodily depths and open expanse, and calls this the basic sustaining interpenetration provides a bodily form for communion and relatedness in life. This notion of cosmologies, this idea of interpenetration is not new. Lata Mani speaks about what she calls the Tantra of Living, which looks at practices of breathing, body, forest, and ground that exist in many cultures and spaces. Finally, loss is also foregrounded in this work as an epistemic wound that this practice potentially helps heal. Loss registered as multi-textured emptiness, absence, and theft is kept through different PAR encounters. Posthumanist practice-informed thinkers shift the question of interpenetration as they reflect on organisms such as kelp to offer us a model of being and relationality that moves from the humanist idea of the bounded individual, whose relationality we must then describe in gestures of penetration. Instead, they consider ecological entanglements as co-constitutive elements of life and death in the planet's own economy through the way kelp is done and undone in relation to whole ecologies of marine and extramarine life, as Berg et al. But these ideas, despite one's personal preferences to the way the words might resonate, that is, phallic or matrixial, do not have to be mutually exclusive descriptions. Who is the journey woman? The journey woman emerges through a set of artistic experiments and collects losses, songs, stories, corpses, ancestors, snakeskins, hair, dreams, rocks, desires. She walks, she births, she sings, she recites. If I should say that she remains a gatherer of journeys on a never completed journey towards the journey woman, what would I mean? The X in the journey woman has signified a fluidity not only of a journey through gender, but also through the self and the collective. So the individual journey woman could be on an incomplete journey towards the collective, or the collective on an incomplete one to her, or they are reaching themselves and she herself. Is this word bandage? It is the plurivocality that the écriture feminine workers of the 70s promised us, and which now finds utterance on the tongues of the journey women. Um, Over a year before 2020, from early 2019 onwards, Priyadarshini John, who started thegnoos.com, wrote 3 extremely powerful articles about whales in captivity, starting with the story of Tilakam. The 3 articles are called A Killer Whale's Guide to Going on Strike, A Killer Whale's Guide to Captivity, and there's one on sperm whales. I'd like to read, I think I will come back to that. These stories that she writes, and the one on the sperm whale where she looks at the codas and the clicks, in a sense prepare me for a numinous encounter that I myself have in July 2020 during lockdown in Johannesburg. This and sea seal whale images that arrive in poems in authentic movement sessions the year before. So this numinous encounter in July is time that I take away for a year, a month of some kind of withdrawal. It's the year that, it's the month that both my father and a friend died. This friend, Nikosinati, killed himself. He was in South Africa and came, and I met him. I met him in India, and after I arrived, he killed himself about 4 or 6 weeks later. And they both died on the same day. And there's this constant coming back to what those losses meant at particular times when there was also a lot of political strife for students in South Africa at that point of time. So July is a time of withdrawal. It's a time of connection. It's a time of seeking what the ancestral voices want from me. And in July 2020, during lockdown, when I went into it, I was living in a room of a friend, and it was up on a hillside. And apart from following practices of listening and thinking, I started watching these whale videos. And it was over one night when it seemed as if the clicking of the whales went right through my body and seemed to fertilize me. It's ironic that the whales were sperm whales, and they were this, and the video is available on YouTube to go and look at. And there was something extremely powerful of this penetration of sound through mediatization. And then when I heard later about other activists who've been activated really sitting and looking at screens, it does make me think what's happening in transmission. So to say that this sudden extreme love for the whale made me think about research and about desire, because I love sushi and I love fish and I still eat all of it. But it did make me think about the fact that I didn't want another whale killed. It made me think about what consumption and how does one connect without consuming, but also dealing with the question of how desire demands consumption in a certain way. You do want to eat the other. And speaking about this at Queer at Queen's last October, November, Hilary McKillen came up with a helpful reformulation of also then considering consumption without exploitation. So it's both these sort of formulation of ideas that I consider even as I think about research and I think about desire and I think about research as a way of also wanting to know and consume the other, but as I also think about others and lovers. And as I think of fish curry and I think of oceans and I think about the gruesome love of eating the other. Seeing, I want to touch. Touching, I want to taste. Tasting, I want to swallow whole. My tongue swells, all my throat is locked. I respond through the memory of a woman's body, childhood floating dead fish in a foreign continent. Our two countries share the Indian Ocean, shores rich with memories of the dispossessed. We came on the first wave, we came later. We bought our own passage, we were sold. This became home, how is home? We came to Bombay a few years ago, it was a work trip. I have friends there. Grandma remembers her village, I'm sure everything's changed so much. My favorite dish to make is dried fish, clunky cut brinjals in a mud chili tomato curry. We wait for hours as the house fills with appa's sweat and clangs turbulent marriages in the kitchen. These days are rare. I did not know that they would also end. I never asked for the recipe. What does my skin sing? Should I decide to break at the first crash of the ocean's song? My father hides my color with a fully Hindu name. My mother's ancestry breaks through like fault lines of a communally toxic country. Suddenly, the men find it easier to ask me out. He says my new Christian name when he comes. He might go blind if the naked goddess is Hindu. I see what my father was trying to do. I forgive his erasures and embrace my lines. These are not my faults. I stopped seeing men after that one. We rise pride on these streets, Bangalore's first. My girlfriend is behind the camera. We walk past temples, police vans, and coffee tin houses. Intoxicated by the blueness of the sky, my sari spirals Mysore gold emblems. We are all queens again. The East Coast is pink this day, we are told. Berlin mermaids brew sisterhood at dusk, and we have our fill. We like skin, sense of new cultures on our stoves. I cannot resent they who love me for an oriental shipment on their shore. We embrace like Biko's promise, a Mbembe dream. Some dark night we stop seeing, finally cherish what we had become far across all the shine of skin. I promise myself recipes from memories of Appa's pots to put ingredients into the fire and wait for childhood to fill the room. I know I will get it right with perfect boiled rice on the side. I will play all of Ilayaraja's songs and slow cook the karwad. It may take more than the night. I can wait. Should the sea have an octopus-limbed tongue, would it speak all the stories my ancestors and descendants are waiting to hear from me? Can I become the sea for a day? Will you come sail on me, lie in the sun next to me, allow me to whisper my final secret into your hair? And if you cannot, will it be enough to know we ate each other on alien shores and forgave our appetites? More than all first tastes, we found we stayed longer than the flavor of an exotic beast. Grew homely habits and simple cravings, pancakes with sugar, bread with coffee, conversations only your eyes could fill. My tongue recedes, its swelling for an ocean tide harboring strange sea creatures, multi-limbed, holding love in its grasp. Each kiss on this lip awakens a sleeping ancestor, giggles a new descendant to life. In such magic kitchens, how can we stop our kissing or our eating? Busi?
Hello, everyone. I was still taking in what Manola has just read, and I'll be reading the poem on the screen. I guess I can just read it from the screen. Blood in the water, air, and air. Now the blood sits on the surface of the water, cannot be washed away, travels through it like that, like plastic that cannot be broken down by years. We are not responsible for the carnage. We are the body, the blood that makes the water red. Not even blue waters can hide away the colors.
I think, thank you. Thanks, Busi. Coming out of those two questions around consumption and consummation were different experiences even on the land here in the Western Cape, where during apartheid time, anyone who knows South African history will know that a lot of these beaches were not accessible to people of color. And I've collected stories of that here. And while we were in residency, we faced some of that sort of inherent sort of violence that just seems to spill over. And that's when there were all of these underbellies of desire, of being on the land, of the dreams that we had. And here I'd like to bring in the phrase of the dark torch. Part of the work that I started and have been doing over the last year in terms of dealing with trauma is to keep building and resourcing the body and the psyche's capacity for pleasure and joy, and as we build those experiences, to resource resilience for the body and the psyche. And so in a sense, looking with some amount of curiosity and desire for experiences of pleasure, and still not being able to completely deny the history of the water or the violence in the water and through the water, that there is both blood in the water and that the ocean is good to me, and both of these are true, that I fear the water and I know freedom each time I enter the ocean, and that both these are true. That the water washes away the blood on our hands, the ocean reminds us of violent histories, that both these are true. Priya's articles start with the killer whale, the orca Tilikum story. Tilikum was kept in captivity and killed 3 people, I think. And so there is this, there is this story and of violence. And there is this story of captivity, which actually starts this journey of what Priya then shares, what Priya translates as something that creates this numinous encounter. And it took me a long time. I still have not watched Whale, been able to, and I don't think I will look at the videos of orcas in captivity. But there was a time when we were talking, and when I was interviewing Priya, and I asked her about watching those videos and what it was, and she said that for some time she watched them, almost everything that she could see, that she had to watch it, and that experience of kind of really going into that dark tunnel was the dark torch that she crafted. So she calls it the crafting of the dark torch that helps to shine a dark light on the world. And that Tilikum, this orca that, kind of bit his teeth off on the grails and who did these different things, it was the deaths caused that also then made some of the movements against SeaWorld and all of these all of these other spaces that have used whales for entertainment and captivity. So she speaks of that journey as this sort of dark torch. And I think for my own self, living in the Western Cape, it was impossible to not look at some of the history of violences that have been there against the right whales as well as the sperm whales this side, including this book here called The Cruel Harvest, and that looks at the plight of the southern right whale and the history of false bay whaling since 1792 to 1932, and these waters that were just extremely bloody, and also kind of deciding and choosing or knowing when to stop. And I think that question of when is enough is a question I think that most researchers, and even when we work with students, or I myself as a researcher faced, is can we think about even our desire for knowledge and knowing as something that must have limitations, that there comes an intuitive point where you do have to go into the tunnel with stuff, but there is something at some point you also stop, and what that stopping point is. When does it build a torch and when does it become something that replicates a practice, or which kind of creates that. So that's something about knowing when to stop, that it just seems to be quite important in this practice. I don't want to take the whole hour into the presentation, so I'm going to move a little more quickly through these slides, and to say that there is something around. I'd like to talk about the sea experiments in ocean grounding, but to look at the ocean as also then an anxious space, but also looking at anxiety and somehow the way some of the symptoms, the physical symptoms of panic and desire are the same. And how does one ground that? And what does one do with both of that? I found the thinking of the Rux Media Collective at the Yokohama Triennale opening address extremely useful here. As they say that one of the things that we need to do is to think about life with toxicity and with the self-knowledge that the banishment is an extreme cruelty and profound folly. So as they kind of worked through a whole set of things that was also just looking at hugely toxic nuclear waste and damage and artwork that had been created from it, this extremely important idea that you cannot recover from a loss into a clean space, but how does one live with toxicity? How does one live with conditions of terminality or pain? And as I go to the beach every day, I can either walk through the path that's slightly longer and just see the mountains and the ocean, or I can go through this tunnel. This underground tunnel from the main road to the beach sometimes has feces on the side. So it's not a route I want to take. And at the same time, I'm like, but who cleans up the shit? And, someone doesn't have another place to shit, and that's why they're shitting there. And how does one deal with that? And, when I went back 2 days later, or actually a week later, it had been cleaned. I don't know who did it, but it's there. And I think the other information connected to this contamination of, I think, us as beings in society, where some are in such extreme vulnerability and others, and also the leakage into the ocean, because 2 years ago, the fecal count in the water was quite high and almost dangerous levels, though that was not happy knowledge of facts for the beach and tourism industry. So those are some of the things. But to say that on the other side of this tunnel are these birds also painted on, and that they're here. Okay, where do I want to go from here? I think I'm going to skip this slide and move to one of the things that we came through, which we're going to move into, which is the matrixia, which comes out of three sources: Gordon Lawrence's social dreaming matrixia, Brasha Ettinger's matrixial bodice space. It's this idea of relationality, of that moves away from what Ruth Urigre writes about in I Love Towards You, which I was initially fascinated by, because she too talks about how does one love without consuming or being consumed, and she adds towards as a space of distancing and relationality, so as a sort of third space. But I think what happens with kelping, or what happens with Brasha Ettinger's matrixial bodice space, is that we accept our half-formed subjectivities, that in a sense there is a way in which we are never complete. And that we are constantly made complete by each other, by the ecology, and that this kelping and this kind of interpenetration into both ecologies, but also cosmologies of the psyche and of each other, is part of how we move into life. The other is the Saptamatrikas, which I'm happy to talk about later. And that this was a visit made last month to Hermanus. This is an old site that it's an old laundry site because the water from the taps in the 1900s was muddy and dirty. And there was this source of water. There's a little trickle and a waterfall that comes here, and there are the rocks. So the laundry would be brought here to be washed. And when I went through this site, it's extremely beautiful. The water just keeps, the ocean is hitting the rocks. And there was just this reflection of, why am I here? To wash my tongue. The poem, the song that you heard earlier, which is a song that I wrote and which Hope performs, was originally written as a sonnet. It followed the Shakespearean sonnet style because I like the way sonnets are written. I like the way that I like the rhyming structure. I like the way that it builds on a thought and has the couplet at the end. And I'm sitting here talking about decoloniality and also dealing with this tongue that wants to poke sonnets out of itself, you know. And I think somewhere also then reconciling with this being of the self, that the washing of the tongue is not to clean out, but it is also to just wash through other waters and through other sounds. And because it cannot come, and it does not move towards erasure. Yeah. When pain dissolves into joy,
when pain dissolves into joy, I would spend months learning to write without cutting my hand off. I am working my heart for this pen, teaching it to trust the ink. Allow the waves to wash over me like ocean waves. Let the truth find its own language, and I will draw enough water from the bottom of my stomach to cleanse my tongue. Also, want to take this time to say, like, it has been a really transformative time being in residency with Manola and developing this work, and to be drawn to the ocean and tell its stories versus our own experiences has been a really amazing experience. Thank you so much for sharing the journey with me, Manola.
Okay. I don't think that the interweaving could have happened without both Pussy's presence and words, and the weaving that I took to the ocean, which is in my hair then. Why do you wear braids in a sari, they ask. Oh, I don't know, to compensate for the Englishness of a tongue and the scholarliness of a mind, I suppose. I'd like you to experience perhaps the whale Nyctrixia. I miscalculated how much time, but there is something about going deep into the ocean and what deep sea divers do in terms of their bodies transforming and not breathing, so that it really turns the question of breath and not breathing on its head here, and to think around some kind of political turmoil and panic, and the time to go in really deep and function on a different capacity of breath sometimes, but also of this relationality and this co-holding that that helps rebuild. So there's that's something to share here. And I'd like to end with just both this image and Pussy's poem about a river grows up to meet.
A river grows up to meet the sea and becomes it. May the water in me meet the water in you. Thank you so much.
And I also want to thank Hilary McCallum who shared these images of these two whales that she saw off the coast of Australia when she was with her partner visiting there. And I'm going to close here my presentation. And I invite my colleague Welma De Beer to co-share this space with me now. How do I do this? How do I stop sharing?
You should have a button, but I
Okay,
can't. Do you want me to stop the sharing? I can
has
stop
it
it if
stopped
you want.
now?
I think it's still going. Here, I'll turn it off.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
All right. So for the next, it's 7:53 here. So for the next 20 minutes, before we have maybe 15 minutes of question answer, for the next 20 minutes, I invite Welma to co-hold a space of the matrix here with me. It's I call this an associative space for people to for you to, and invite you to share associations you might have made as you listened. It's a space really of associative thinking and connecting before we move into a space of, that's more dialogical. So people are welcome to share.
Thank you, Manola, for that. So this is Ter speaking. Like there were certain moments that you spoke about. So desire. How do we feel when things are taken away? And for me, I was just like, where's the world right now? And I think that's something so important to me. Like where are we right now? Are we able to go through it? Are we able to go through the emotions and all of that? So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Stay, which I have a little association with that, and speaking about where are we now and where are we going from here. And for me, it's almost like that association, that picture of the tunnel, do we go under and through? Do we need the dark torch, or do we take the scenic long route? Yeah, which is the route to take in these cases, and how do we navigate it? That's what's coming up for me.
Hi everyone, as Maketi. Thank you for the presentation. My association, it's loss, and the thought and the idea of being aware of loss, and not just only on our human being spaces, but externally. That how laws just infiltrate in every space, and the effect of being aware of loss and story. Yeah, those are things that I'm sitting with.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you.
Yeah, thank you. It was very beautiful what I heard you speaking and telling the poems. Very beautiful, extremely beautiful, I would say. If I could share my association, actually, it's inspired with the reality, because you were talking of this, actually also showing beautiful pictures of blue ocean, which can be traumatic, but also inspiring. And what I have behind the window for last 3 days, it's a cold gray rain. And actually what I caught from your speaking was this, the weather may cause trauma, metaphorically, but not only. Thank you.
The association that's been coming up for me with water is I've been exploring more rivers than the sea, and how different animals kind of navigate the currents. So the other day I was watching swans, how they try and stay upright and dignified, pretending everything is fine. But of course, underneath they are paddling like crazy. Whereas the ducks were just so playful in the current. They just got washed down with the current and kind of dashed into safety in the reeds, and then got washed down again. And so I was just, having that association with whales, like the way they navigate currents, and how do we get sort of taken by currents? Do we fight against them? Do we flow with them? So that's my association for now. And thank you, Manola. It's been an honor to be here.
Hi, Manola, that was absolutely wonderful. I feel like I'm floating in your ocean, you know, in this bubble that I'm breathing into, but I don't really want to surface from it. I'm just enjoying breathing into this space. And I was thinking when you were talking about the visible and the invisible worlds, and how part of being in the invisible world is the world of internal sensation. You know, we all of us in a certain kind of way are always floating around in this internal bubble of sensation, which is particular to us, which is sort of it's not visible to other people, but we're in it, and we're in it all the time. So I feel like I'm now softly cocooned between the visible and the invisible worlds, and joining you in the ocean. Thank you.
Sian writes in, the largest hearts of the planet are in whales' bodies. Perhaps an ocean of compassion will help us flow along the difficult times of our histories and present moment. Thanks for that, Sian.
Manola, there's another thing that you said that was so powerful. We cherish what we have become.
Excuse me, may I ask a question?
I'm keeping the space to continue with associations, and in about 7 minutes, we can move into question answers. So, yeah. I'm actually enjoying the silence a lot because I can hear the sound of the ocean. And Vivian also reminded me of the currents in my body now, and I'm sort of also flowing and feeling their activation as well. And enjoying that really just now.
I can share, hi everyone, something about that's remaining with me, the floating and the tides and the mystery. And I'm throughout the entire presentation, I'm just floating with something about empathy and being able to crawl and swim and float into the empathy of the other, into the body and the life of the other. And I'm hearing it in sounds, and I'm hearing it in whispers, fear and life. So I'm just filled with this entire new world of possibilities of entering the space of the other, the whale, the other, the life, the kelp. So thank you very much. Thank you.
I'm also nibbling at the delicious mystery of the other just now.
If I can come in here as well. Thank you, Manola, so much. I'm having very sensory associations of sound. I'm also in a place where I can hear ocean and traffic, and I'm fortunate enough to have the most incredible view of Cape Town skyline. And I have a 7-year-old on my lap who is falling asleep, and really feeling the weight of his body and the feeling of his breath against me. Yeah, and I'm so grateful to be still and present to it in this moment. So I really thank you for that, Manola.
I like how some of the things that sink in and seem to disappear resurface up. And my association with like the 7-year-old on Wenya's lap is that the first whales I saw were all calving. Well, when I actually saw them, and it was the mother and her calf. And that the matrixian, that image, is really also of the womb and that. So I'm happy to have that float back up through your sensory body, Wenya. Thank you.
And Karen, the cook, wrote in the chat box, thank you, Manola. This was beautiful. Reminded of how the whale teaches us to go deep within the ocean of ourselves to find what we have lost. And then Annette Islander wrote, thank you. I'm longing for the ocean, sitting on an island far up in the north, which is so big that there is no way to go to the sea. But the wind blows across the plains from the sea. Beautiful, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Again, I'll also like to say that, in the residency also, as Manola also mentioned in the presentation, like we look at access to the beach, like for people. And as someone who grew up in Mamelodi, in a township in Victoria, having to be in a space where we can walk to the beach, even though there was kind of resistance and struggles that we experienced when we were in residency, but just having that kind of access to the beach in a place where majority of the people, where the white people, is seen. I think it was a privilege, although it was a very powerful privilege, because this is South Africa. You'll imagine that in every part of the country, when you go, you'll find lots of Black people, lots of people of color, but just experiencing that. And there was a moment in one of the days when we were in residency where we were swimming with the whales, and we also got to see like such a full moment. I've always written around water and fire, but I'm scared of fire. And I grew up in a township. I've hardly ever been near the ocean. So for the first time, I felt more connected to the water, more connected to an element that I write so much from. And it's such a beautiful experience to be able to not write from theory for the first time, but to write from experience, to write from whatever the ocean invokes inside me. And yeah, and I believe that I love that the residency was not like theoretical, but it was like we wake up, we live, we write, we read, we research, and that kind of research setting made the writing experience a lot more authentic and real for me. Like I could feel the words that I was writing, I could live them out. I knew that they were real because I was experiencing them as I was writing them. And yeah, that's what I would like to say. That is my association as a participant in the residency.
Thank you, Supraja, for your comment, because she talks about how it's we're also today is Ambedkar's birthday. It's a whole bunch of ancestor birthdays, and Ambedkar was the revolutionary anti-caste writer of the Constitution as well. And yeah, so thank you for that reference back. I'm going to move in for the last 19 minutes into a more discursive space of conversation for those interested and wanting to stay on for that. And yeah, and keeping, I suppose, that the space now open for questions, answers, or reflections. Yeah, of a more discursive nature, if that's where you're headed right now. I think one of the things I'd like to sort of bounce off to see how other practitioners are thinking through through practice, but also, you know, so when I was working through and coming to this presentation and knowing that I wanted to do this sort of set of sharings that would open up escape, escape that could then become this moment, and which was what I was hoping could activate. I'm also thinking out of what we call theory, what practitioners refuse to want to call wisdom traditions, also because there's a resistance, because this is knowledge too. But I think two things that have been sitting with me is to think around philosophical cosmologies vis-a-vis theoretical frameworks, and how does that sit in our embodied practices. And so, for example, both the fact, for me, there was a sort of intuitive clues that came in poetry and in dreams. And then in the residencies that I made, I found myself seeing the sites that I had written about or had dreamt about. So there was that sort of an intuitive unfolding. And, you know, I think as practitioners for a long time, we sat with the question of what makes rigor. And I think in some conversations over the last year, we've been thinking we need to think about legibility rather than legibility as a certain kind of rigor. And I suppose find a way of tracking, and both with what Vivian and Philip were sharing, you know, these practices that are there within somatic work of tracking like little fluctuations within the body. How does one track that as a sort of intuitive process in research, map that? And also when one has to just let it go. And I think that sort of dance between the two is something that I kind of sit in the middle of, sometimes feeling I'm floating off in this direction and sometimes feeling here, but kind of enjoying also being in the middle. But I wondered if there were any reflections back to that.
That's a great question, and I have a hard time imagining how I could approach that if it's not through the arts, through the journaling, through the poetry, through the sounds. Like, I'm sitting with my guitar now, and I found that so grounding as I was taking in where you were trying to lead me. And I came up, you know, with just a few chords. And I know I'm going to travel with those chords and add, you know, the C into that now for a while. And I think that's part of our job as artists and artist educators and therapists, to go deeper into the symbolism and the realism that comes. But we have to use our, you know, cognitive and intuitive. So further depth artistic exploration, and we extract meaning from there. So thank you.
If your chords are going to communicate, I would love to hear them.
Yeah. I don't know if you heard, it's I just float with that. And I can do this for a few hours. Into the sea and that whale that I see. And we be, can we be? I see that, can we and it's part of my process, to discover a sound. Usually it's a sound on my flute or guitar, and then that takes me into all different spaces. But those were the two chords. I'm not sure how you can hear it, but so.
It was beautiful, and I was doing a little thing, but I saw Stay moving to it as well. So there was a sort of responsive current that happened with that. So thank you. I think what also Busi shared earlier was around the coming through the experience through this language. And when I brought together the question of epistemic freedom, and that desire was a pathway to that freedom, desire that works through Priya's dark torch sometimes, but through pleasure and connection as well. And that is the route, I think, that I want to sail over or into after all the extremely hard work that the post-colonial and decolonial scholars have done before us. But as an artistic researcher now, and in this moment, registering these things as what we need to hold, and I think living with a sense of the terminality or the condition of that there is this up and down, that there is grief, that there is loss that is irrecoverable, and that there is also joy, and just kind of sitting with all of these together. Mm-hmm. And I said, initially when I read Priya's articles and then I had my own numinous encounter with the whales, I was just so excited and happy. And then the more I read about whaling history, I was just in shock, and I was like, why would they communicate with us? It's like, why would they communicate with us? And I think Sian is right. They have these big brains with really huge capacity to feel and have empathy, and that it's also a call for transformation. I'm not too surprised that I was sitting in South Africa, which took as its political will and choice, in spite of all the difficulty that is happening with education, with the need to make it accessible and have universal education as an option here, as well as the land rights question. But that sort of political choice that was made, and I think as an outsider, however the history here unfolds, the heart of that possibility that was in a way fierce, to sort of rethink that notion of transformation is something that we can't do without the kelp and the whales and the ocean and the ecology, and that sense of, the sense of these multiple cosmologies, and that we are sort of together in it is where I'm sort of sitting, and sometimes feeling overwhelmed when a part of me, a very tiny part of me, which thanks to more experiences with both my colleagues and friends in Drama for Life and my other artistic researchers, I grow in my strength and courage, and also with the kind of conversations I've had with Ben and others, grow in the strength and the courage of allowing this plurivocality, these registers, to be the knowledge to speak from and to move in and through. While, I don't even want to mention what the other kind of scholarship would look like for me at that moment, but just to say that.
I wanted to say something about that. Yes. and also respond to what you said before. I mean, for me, something that comes through so strongly in your work that really has come through since I met you, but I keep thinking about it again, like, what is this that is so fascinating and inspiring to me? And it very much came through in the talk today. It's exactly that kind of, there's a kind of fluid relation to these different things, and they're so different from each other that they don't even have the same names. Like I'm talking about different cosmologies and different disciplinary or theoretical formations, as you said, frameworks. They're different disciplines. They're different geographies as well at work. And there's different institutional frameworks. Like, you know, the university is present there, but it's not the only thing that's present there at all. And I feel inspired by the way that I feel that you model a kind of movement. It's not exactly, it doesn't feel exactly like a movement between them or even a navigation. Like, it feels much more organic than that. And I think that you really hit upon or something unlocked for me when you were describing it in relation to desire, because I'm thinking, like, how does one kind of navigate these different institutions, or how does one move between this disciplinary formation and this cosmology and this register? I mean, how does one move between a kind of scholarly presentation, theoretical presentation, an autobiographical register, a poetic register, music, image, all these different things that we might work with in artistic research, but also it's something much larger than artistic research, right? It's a way of being. And I think that what you said about following paths of desire and following paths of pleasure and connection is something that I really want to learn from, in terms of how to move through and among and kind of make connections in a simple way between these different frameworks, these different registers, different ways of presenting, different institutional, you know, and in terms of legibility, kind of like creating a presentation, creating a piece of writing, but there's different kinds of writing, there's different kinds of now video work and music that can come out of things. Yeah, it seems simple, but there's some, I mean, centering desire and embodied pleasure and embodied connection in that way as a kind of guiding principle or a foundation for a research pathway is, it's very profound, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to read out what Elizabeth's written here. Thank you for that, Ben. Following small fluctuations in the body, I understand through yoga and improvisation dance practice, what helps me navigate that close observation is transitioning between sensing inside the body and attention to the space and things outside the body. Thinking of what is outside as supporting the moving still body. I love that sense of both that interpenetration that's happening there that Elizabeth talks about. And to respond, I think, to one thing that I didn't really speak about, which was time and desire and time and pleasure, and the body and skin as also these limits, because there's a way in which it's all open. And, you know, when we think about structures, we think of them as limiting, but also that those limitings are contained, that they're not institutionally, but within the body, that the skin and the flesh, as much as it opens out, what does it help also contain? And I think only on a keel of desire, desire produces yearning and pain, and it can produce depression. You know, it can move into panic, it can go elsewhere. And I think to shift from desire also into pleasure, and that they're actually two different, there's almost a different sense of ontology, because pleasure for me is presenced. It's embodied and it's now and it's present. Whereas desire has a compulsion of futurity to it. It has a compulsion of something that you move towards and arrive or wait for. And it's that relationship between desire and pleasure, but finding pleasure as, though of course one has pleasurable thoughts and other things, but that there is something extremely embodied and present and also limited about pleasure, and to kind of, I think, to come back to the sufficiency of what is enough as well, which I think is important, which leaves me on 4 minutes. Priya, were you going to say something?
I have a question, actually. I was like sitting and typing it out, but maybe it'll be faster for me to ask. So I wanted to ask about the consumption thing. You were talking about this desire to consume. And I know when I write, if I write about a text, how I manage to keep it alive. And one way is to not write about the text, but to write through the text. So if I'm referring to a story, I'd literally write what the characters were doing, etc. Like, that's a technical effort in writing. I just want to know, in this context, in your work, how do you expect to consume something and keep it alive at the same time? What replenishes what's taken?
I think that's an extremely difficult question, but at the same time, my senses of the relationality and so I can give examples for you, for example, that I go, and also then this goes again in terms of, is the whale communicating? Is the ocean communicating violent histories? If I'm bleeding and if I'm weeping, is it an act of reparation for a violent history? Is there something being transformed in grieving, in creating ritual grief? Is that something that's made? That's one sense of it. The other sense of it is that the otherness of the other is not just mysterious, but it's also sometimes completely unapprehendable. Like, I put my hand out and I'm extremely excited that this goose over the space of an hour moves towards me and is, touching my hand, but it's nibbling at it because it thinks I'm giving it food. What we've come to with that relation into that encounter are completely different. So to say that the otherness of the other is to perhaps not fully know what you're taking or what you're taking from the other, and to consider around the tracking. And I think to live somewhere with the sense of that contamination, if you want to call that, or that of the violence of the water and the violence of that as well, in not knowing, but also I think in these things that I'm not quite sure how I can say that I think that when Busi and I processed that much pain over a weekend, that we shifted something. But to believe, how do I state that? Maybe I'll have a way to state it later. But to say that, I just, but if there's, we're finishing, I hopefully on time, but if there's anyone else who wants to respond to that very profound question, I'd just like to give an opportunity for that.
I'll say something quickly. What I think when I complete a work, no matter what kind of work it's been, when it's done, it's done. When it's done and when it's out there, it's out there. And in a certain kind of way, it has a life that's beyond me. It's not mine anymore. So that's part of the way that I think about that and answer the question of replenishment. That's done. And then there's going to be the next one that comes. And my full attention will go to that next one. But for me, the question, Manola, is, how do you know when it's done?
Well, I do think of time as a good boundary of terminality, and skin, for example, as forming over that. And I think the paradigm, Vivian, I think the way what evoked for me and what you offered out there was that you cannot work in the register of a reciprocity, which means I give this and you take this, and I give this and you take this, but that it does have to shift into other cosmologies without sliding quickly into exploitation and saying we can't do this, and it's an extremely sort of nuanced tracking. And I think here again, to come back to our own cells and our bodies, that some of the depth work happening within somatics of doing those tracking to shift pathways might help us. But just to answer your question, I'm going to go by the time and say that this is enough now. But this has been so enriching, and I really thank everyone for their presences here, and especially the inspirers and co-collaborators and co-thinkers, both in Drama for Life, but within the projects, Priya, Busi, Welma, and thank you.
And we thank all of you very much for coming, Manola and and Pussy, and everyone who was speaking, and all of the participants here who came and joined and spoke in this lovely session. Thank you so much. I should mention that we hope to be putting this online as a video as well. If you said anything and you want to be removed from the video, just contact me. But also, I should say that the other sessions from our Lines of Flight series hopefully will also be available. So if you do want to see, we've had some other presentations that were also lovely. And we hope to catch up with all of you next year in our next series. Thank you.